The decade of the 1960s was an era of great expansion for the popular arts, including rock and roll. Backgrounding the period were new developments in media technology, the use of the recording session musician, and of course the political and cultural elements of the 1960s. Perhaps the most significant movement of the 1960s was the student activism and awareness movement. College students, their instructors, as well as high school students and their instructors, became the moving force behind the cultural movement of the 1960s. Other movements of the 1960s included the civil rights movement, which espoused itself both in a nonviolent and a militant side. The civil rights movement of the 1960s supported actions on behalf of African Americans, but also women and older citizens, particularly through the Gray Panther movement. This was a time of anti-establishment and anti-war protest. Lifestyle was also a part of the growth of the 1960s through the flower children and the hippies. And of course, the entire 60s was backgrounded by the drug culture. Most important to our discussion, however, is the fact that many of the new popular musicians of the 1960s were now college-trained musicians. This college musical training brought a great deal of new complexity to the music, both in style and in the inclusion of new influences from outside of rock and roll, such as classical music and world music. Another new area of activity of great effect on rock and roll was the use of new media technology in the creation of the art. To that end, we will talk primarily about two musicians, the first being a musician by the name of Phil Spector, and the second being a guy by the name of Berry Gordy Jr., who we will discuss a little bit later in relationship to Motown. Phil Spector in 1957 was a 17-year-old producing prodigy who produced his first relative minor hit song, To Know Him Is to Love Him, that was dedicated to his father. He recorded it with a group called the Teddy Bears and made a relative minor sensation out of the recording. Spector was based in Los Angeles at the time and took the opportunity to start traveling the country, first to Philadelphia, then to New York, where he did produce another relative hit called Spanish Harlem by the artist Ben E. King. By 1960 and his 20th birthday, Spector found himself back in Los Angeles, where he renewed an acquaintanceship with another recording producer by the name of Les Sill. Together they formed a recording company called Phil Les Records, and they started having significant success for the next 3 years between 1960 and 63. The duo recorded primarily in the teen tune genre using girl groups such as the Chiffons, the Shirelles, and the Ronettes. Of more importance to this discussion, however, rather than the artists or even the tunes that were being done, was the new technology that Phil Spector created to help produce his music. Sound-on-sound recording was a technology that had originally been experimented with by Les Paul, who's also credited with creating the solid-body electric guitar. Spector took the technology a step forward by creating what is known as multi-track recording. Typically, for a large group sound on a recording, prior to this point in the early 1960s, you had to assemble large numbers of musicians in the same studio and record them all at the same time. Multi-track technology allowed you to put smaller groups of musicians together and record them separately, and then layering the smaller groups against one another for the larger sound on the recording. The effect is something like piling a number of tape recorders, one on top of the other, and then recording one set of sounds into the first recorder, synchronizing that with the rest of the recorders and recording separate sounds onto each of the other recorders. Then the last step of the process would be to download, essentially, all of the recordings onto the same 2-track tape so it sounds like a larger group of musicians. This allowed Spector to create instrumentally very dense recordings without using great numbers of musicians. By doubling what each musician would do 3 or 4 times, he could get away with 5 musicians and make it sound like 30. Spector added to this instrumental density by also using a new process that would eventually be called equalization, which adds to the density of the higher and lower frequencies of sound, making a sound much more expanded. Process would be very similar to you turning on your CD player in your car and turning up the treble and the bass to enhance the higher and lower frequencies. With the multi-track recording and the equalization process, Phil Spector's recording sounded much more dense than any of the other recordings of the period, and soon his recordings were being referred to as Phil Spector's Wall of Sound. Phil Spector was also known as a tyrant in the studios with a maniacal attention to detail. He demanded perfection from all of his musicians, from the vocal groups, from whom he demanded perfect enunciation and pitch, to the instrumentalists, and he would make as many as 10 to 12 different takes of the same tune to establish a perfection in the performance. This also established his reputation as a terrible producer to work for. Phil S. Records produced dozens of big hits with girl groups between 1960 and 1963, although this period ended pretty much with the advent of the Beatles in 1964. Another important area in the influence on rock and roll during the 1960s was the use of the recording session musician. The session musician was an animal that had been around since the beginning of commercial recording back in the 1920s. A recording session musician is a musician who has to have two very particular skills. First is the skill of sight reading, or being able to read the music correctly at first sight. The second skill is the knowledge of all kinds of different styles of music, including perhaps classical, country music, rock and roll, and others. Ahmet Ertegun was the son of a Turkish ambassador to the United States. During the late 1940s, he created his own recording company called Atlantic Records. Atlantic Records was a record company that dealt primarily with race records. In particular, they recorded rhythm and blues during the 1950s. Toward the end of this period of the 1950s, one of his most important producers and the vice president of his company, a guy by the name of Jerry Wexler, came to Ertegun with a new idea. The idea was to invest in the new music that was coming down the pike at this point, called soul music. To this end, Atlantic Records invested itself in what would later be called Southern Soul by going to Memphis, Tennessee, and buying up several small recording labels and their associated recording studios. One of these labels was called Stax Records, S-T-A-X, and with it came a recording studio that had its own coterie or stable of recording session musicians. This group of musicians was led by two contractors, one by the name of Steve Cropper, a guitarist, and the other one Donald Dunn, also known as Donald Duck Dunn, a bassist. Later in the 1970s, both of these musicians would show up with the Blues Brothers Band as a guitar player and bass player. The group of musicians at Stax Records during the late part of the 1950s, early 1960s was so good that it was well known by a nickname called the Marquees. All of the Stax artists, as well as other artists from all around the country, came to Stax recording studios just to record with the Marquees. Steve Cropper, incidentally, also was a fine music composer, having co-written the tunes Soul Man and In the Midnight Hour as soul hits. In the early 1960s, Cropper, Dunn, and the Marquees left the studio to become feature recording instrumental musicians. With organist and leader Booker T. Jones, they formed a new group called Booker T. and the MGs, which recorded many hit instrumental songs throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s. When the Marquees moved out of the studio as session musicians, they were replaced by another core of musicians from Stax Recording that soon earned themselves their own nickname, the Bar-Kays. By the mid-1960s, even the Bar-Kays left the studios and formed the backup group for the popular soul musician Otis Redding. Atlantic Records had also bought another set of studios and recording labels down in Alabama in a place called Muscle Shoals, Alabama. In this new location, they formed their own coterie of studio musicians that became very famous in their own right, becoming called the Muscle Shoals Sound Rhythm Section. Motown Records in Detroit also had their group of very well-known studio musicians. This group of studio musicians throughout the 1960s were called the Funk Brothers, and they were led by keyboardist Earl Van Dyke. In addition to recording most of the instrumental tracks during the 1960s for Motown, they were also the musical tutors of the young Stevie Wonder at 10 years old, who came to Motown and was tutored by Earl Van Dyke and the rest of the Funk Brothers.